Chapter 14. The Garden That Listened. The first days of the year drifted over Waverly Bay with a simple kindness, as if the town had decided to protect the fragile quiet that followed the night of lanterns and warm bowls of stew. The greenhouse on the hill wore a thin veil of frost in the mornings and breathed gently at dusk, glass panes clouding and clearing as lamps were lowered and raised. Aiden walked the slope each day with his satchel on one shoulder and an extra thermos of tea in the other hand, happy to carry more than he strictly needed because it felt right to arrive ready. Mira kept a small notebook on the bench where they had set the letters during Hearthlight, and in the notebook she wrote what the plants requested by way of light and water and rest, and what the weather allowed, and what hope suggested might be possible when the cold loosened its hold. They worked side by side with the slow care winter invites, checking the lantern frame between tasks, tapping the knots with the backs of their fingers to be sure, polishing the pale aqua piece until the small bubble inside caught even the most modest afternoon light. In the evenings they would walk down to the cafe to leave a card on the board or to read one left by a neighbor, then return to their separate doors in the same easy rhythm that had now become part of the town's understanding of them. The promise of the new year remained warm but quiet, a felt thing rather than a spoken one. Then the weather changed. It did not announce itself with the heavy talk of a storm at first. It began as a far-off murmur along the horizon, a faint line over the water where the sea lost its gentle shine and turned the color of pewter. Gulls that usually drifted in an unhurried script took a more direct path toward the inner cove. The air collected a briny taste that settled on the tongue and told anyone who listened that wind wished to take the lead. By noon a pale band of cloud had thickened into a low ceiling that pressed the roofs and traced the hills with a firm hand. The first strong gusts arrived with the sound of a long curtain being pulled across a stage. Aiden and Mira were already at the greenhouse when the panes began to sing in a high soft note that meant the frame felt the push. Mira checked each latch while Aiden lowered the interior shades where the plants liked a little shelter. The glass house had weathered other winters, and the sound it made was less fear than memory, like an old ship recalling deeper seas. Still, they glanced more often at the bolts that held the ridge and spoke less, working as people do when hands know the work and voices would only be extra weight. The afternoon drew down hard and fast, a gray that swallowed the path and narrowed the view until the town below looked like a handful of small lamps floating in mist. Rain arrived as a fine spray first, then thickened into sheets that you could see moving across the slope, each one a soft wall that struck and passed. The wind folded the rain and flung it back, and the greenhouse began to hum. Mira set the kettle on the small ring of fire because heat of any kind steadies the mind. She placed 2 cups beside it and pressed her hand to the pane near the rosemary to feel whether the cold was trying to take too much. The rosemary stood its ground but asked for company, so she moved a tray of seedlings nearer. Aiden stood at the door and watched the hill for branches, then returned to the bench when the first crack sounded from a tree at the edge of the lane. In storms he kept his energy like a rounded stone in his pocket. It helped. The worst of the wind arrived as night fell, not shrieking but speaking strongly in a steady voice, the kind of sound that is not loud but is relentless. Aiden held the frame while Mira tied fresh cloth around a seam that had started to whisper. They checked the anchor bolts at the corners. They shifted the heaviest pots to the north side. They moved the lantern from the windowsill to a low table at the center so the frame would not sway against it. When the kettle sang, they poured tea and stood breathing steam, eyes on the roofline, hands on the same board, two steady points in a room that had learned to vibrate. They could have gone down the hill. It would have been safe to choose the cafe's back room or the owner's offer of a place by the stove. They stayed because leaving felt more cruel than practical. The greenhouse was not just a structure. It was a patient set of lungs, a long room where roots had learned to trust light and water, and to abandon it in the hour when it asked for witness did not suit either of them. They settled on the bench and kept watch. At some point after midnight, when the storm had spent much of its first strength and discovered reserves, there came a sudden sound different from the rest. A clean strike, not the shiver of a bolt but the short sharp call of glass giving way. Aiden moved first because he was nearer the sound. A pane on the far west side had cracked along its length and a narrow triangle had fallen into the narrow space between frame and shelving. Wind pressed into the room at the seam with a small angry hiss. He put his palm on the frame and felt the will of the weather, not a tantrum, a test. Mira fetched a panel of heavy cloth from the cupboard where she kept winter provisions and handed Aiden a roll of tape and a coil of cord. They worked without hurry, though both understood that speed mattered, the kind of careful speed a person uses when tying a splint or patching a sail. He braced while she climbed a short step and held. She tied while he measured the stretch and tested his knots. They layered cloth on cloth and set the cord in a down and back figure any sailor would recognize. Once the wind pushed so cleanly that Mira had to lean her shoulder into the frame and Aiden had to use his full hand to keep the edge from lifting. When they stepped down at last, the room calmed to a lower pitch. The plants near the seam trembled once and then stilled. They stood facing the patch for a long breath, then exhaled together and laughed the small laugh people share when an unlikely moment passes and the body needs to release what it held. They moved to other trouble spots and made minor repairs, propping a sagging shelf, adding a wedge under a foot, spreading old quilts along the door to keep the worst of the draft from crawling along the floor. They fed the stove. They walked more than they usually did in the small room, as if the floor could benefit from their weight, reminding it that this place belonged to grounded things. Near dawn the wind shifted and began to drop a little. The rain softened into occasional long drops. The sky over the water brightened into a dull pearl. The greenhouse let out a long, soft sound that had no words. They sat together on the bench and let their spines rest against the frame and drank the last of the tea. When morning arrived fully, pale and shaken but intact, They opened the door and stepped into air that smelled like wet cedar and clean salt and a little metal from the storm's touch. From the hilltop they could see the square below holding itself steady. The cafe door opened to let out a breath of warm air and a curl of steam from early cups. The station clock offered its first clear count of the day. The path down the hill showed small branches and a scattering of leaves, but no true harm. It would have been easy to believe the worst had passed and hardly touched them. That belief did not last. By early afternoon, the second wave arrived, broader and heavier than the first, with a weight that came from a long fetch over open water. Gusts pressed each pane in long, steady pushes. The seams that had only whispered now spoke clearly. It did not feel like a contest. It felt like an honest exchange between the weather and a room that had promised to live. The weakness was not a single sheet of glass. The weakness was the connection along the western corner where the old bolts had rusted under a cap and where a seam of caulk had hardened into brittle chalk. Aiden discovered it when the frame gave a small offset that could be felt in the palm. He called Mira to run a hand along the join and she felt it too, a tired place in a bone. There is a set of choices in that moment. A person can hold and hope. A person can retreat and plan. Or a person can choose the third path that is neither hasty nor timid. They chose the third. Mira found the small crate that held the extra hardware, the heavy screws and new brackets she had purchased in late autumn with the same instinct that had led her to press lavender into letters. Aiden set aside his satchel and took off his coat and rolled his sleeves because sleeves get in the way of a decision. He placed his art pencils and his favorite brush in a tin and tucked it safely under the bench. He said he would rather mend what she loved than draw a picture of it, and she looked at him with the kind of steady affection that makes a person taller without moving. They turned the greenhouse into a patient shop. Aiden measured the distance between posts and marked the places where new brackets could sit without fighting the old joints. Mira prepared the brackets, cleaned the posts with a rag, and warmed the screws in her hands so the metal would not bite too fast. He drilled with slow pressure so as not to jolt the glass. She followed with a small driver, turning each screw only until it spoke of enough. They worked in a rhythm that seemed to have been waiting in their bodies. When the wind pushed, they placed their weight together against the frame without counting who held more. When it eased, they moved like a pair of birds building back and forth between bench and corner, tool and seam, knot and tie. They did not say aloud that care is a kind of bridge, but they built one between them in the way they held and passed and checked and knotted. The storm, noticing that the room was loved, turned away from anger and settled into steady effort. Once a pane near the upper ridge did crack and drop a thin shard that slid down the outside like a broken tear. But the new brackets held the corner and the patched cloth at the lower edge held the seam, and the house bent and straightened like a strong reed. By evening the worst had passed. The second night came without stars but with the sound of rain easing into a hush. The greenhouse smelled like wet wood and rosemary and warm metal and tea. Aiden sank to the bench with the kind of tiredness that feels earned, and Mira sat beside him, knees touching, eyes half closed, breathing in time with the small stove. They did not light the lantern. They did not need its flame to understand that the day had already lit something between them. When they stepped outside to look at the hill, the path showed more debris than the morning had, and one branch lay along the lower fence in a way that would need attention. Down in the square, the cafe window glowed and a few neighbors were gathered near the board. They went down to see whether any help was wanted. The owner had set a pot of soup by the stove and lifted bowls for anyone who stepped in with wet hair and grateful eyes. Cards on the board carried small reports of fences that needed mending and a chicken coop that had shed a plank. Aiden and Mira added a note that said the greenhouse had taken a strong breath but remained steady, and that spare cloth and hardware were available to anyone who needed them. A boy with red mittens drew a picture of the station cat under an umbrella, and the attendant laughed and placed it in the corner of the frame. They stayed only long enough to warm their hands and promised to check on the widow who sold greens. Then they climbed back to the hill in a light rain that felt like a friendly tap on the shoulder instead of a push. And they slept well in their separate rooms with the sound of the sea finally returning to its patient voice. In the morning, the work of mending began in earnest. Storms do not finish when the last drop falls. They finish when hands and time have carried quiet back into the places that bent. Mira arrived at the greenhouse with the early light and a tray of simple biscuits to share with anyone who might come up to lend a shoulder. Aiden arrived with his tool roll and a small box of tins that had once held paints and now held screws and washers sorted by size. They began with the fence and the fallen branch. Together they cut and lifted and stacked, and the rhythm of the work turned the air into something cheerful. The widow with neat gloves came up the path with a thermos of broth and hugged them in the careful way a person who loves plants hugs people. The cafe owner sent her nephew with a coil of rope, and he tied knots that remembered his grandfather's boat. The librarian arrived with a roll of soft cloth for delicate glass and a bottle of lemon oil for the wood. The station attendant came with a hammer and a small bucket of nails, and the cat followed at a short distance to supervise from a patch of sun. The hill turned into a gentle workshop where each person had a small task and none felt alone. They raised the west corner slightly and set a proper support beneath it, confident now because the brackets had taken the load. They replaced the cracked ridge pane with a spare that had hidden behind a cabinet since before Mira took the place on. They resealed the brittle seam with a new line that sat neat and clean along the join. While the caulk set, Aiden stood still for the first time in hours and looked at the work laid out before him and felt the same quiet from the night of Hearthlight settle on his shoulders again. Mira saw his gaze and handed him a cup, and they stood side by side without speaking. He would return to the gallery in future months, and he would stand again in rooms where soft lights stroke paper. But the memory that now held a place beside the best of those would be this: a morning of mending where imperfect work had become a kind of music. When the greenhouse asked for detail work, Aiden set aside tools and reached for brushes. He did not reach for his good sable with the felt roll or the little horsehair that danced in his careful hand when he signed a drawing. He took the stiff bristle meant for scrubbing and dipped it in a paste that Mira mixed from lime and water and a spoon of salt, and he lifted each pane that still held watermarks to a clean shine. Mira joked that he was painting light back onto the glass. He accepted the idea and worked as if it were true. He scrubbed and rinsed and dried, and when he finished, the panes wore a soft clarity that made the winter sun seem more generous. She turned her attention to the soil. She loosened the beds with a narrow fork, mixing in compost that smelled like last year's garden made gentle, and tucked shaken seedlings back into steadiness. She whispered to leaves and did not mind that Aiden heard. He steadied small trellises. He cut fresh twine and lowered it around the stems that liked a hand. He checked the lantern frame and retied a knot that had wanted to swagger. He lifted the pale aqua piece to wipe it, then lowered it again and stood back as it captured a wash of late morning and returned it as a held breath. By noon the greenhouse felt proud of itself. By afternoon it looked ready for guests. They kept the door open so the hill could share in the clean smell. Neighbors came and went with their own reports. A fence was now righted. A hen had been found under a crate and encouraged back into her house. The clock tower stairs had leaked a little but would be fine with a bit of attention. The cafe board carried a line that said soup at 5 for anyone shoulder sore, and someone had drawn a bowl with steam rising and a spoon that seemed to wave. Aiden and Mira returned the lantern to its place on the bench and looked at each other with the easy pride of partners who have met a day and held it where it needed to be. They knew the storm had scratched something along the edges of their quiet and that the scratch would take time to fade. But they also knew that what had bent now set back with a deeper sense of itself. As dusk approached, they lit the small lamps in the corners and let the room learn its evening again. The greenhouse made that soft sound it makes when water in pipes settles and air finds its level. The rosemary warmed the air with a low, confident scent. The lantern pieces drifted slightly and then went still. They did not cook a feast. They warmed broth from the cafe and broke a loaf and shared a small jar of olives and sat with their knees touching. Aiden lifted his sketchbook and began to draw, not from habit but from need. And he drew this time not the shapes of objects but the pattern of the day. He drew the diagonal of the bracket against the post, the coil of rope against the fence, the scatter of glass along the cloth before it was swept, the texture of soil where a small fork had lifted and folded, the particular line of Mira's wrist as she tied off a knot on the frame and tested it with the tip of one finger. He wrote a sentence beneath these marks. Nothing fancy, only the truth that care is a way of listening. When he set the book down, she reached and rested her hand briefly on the cover, a touch of agreement rather than praise. The wind outside had become a friendly traveler moving on. The sea sounded like a person speaking softly in the next room. Somewhere below, near the square, the station horn gave a short calm call and the clock answered with the hour. They rose to tidy the last of the tools, wrapped the spare hardware again, folded the cloths, and stacked the panes that had not been needed in a safe corner. Mira wrote a note to leave on the cafe board that said the greenhouse thanks those who came up the hill and that spare hands find their use quickly. And Aiden added a small drawing of a bracket with a sprig of rosemary threaded through it like a ribbon because he liked the way those shapes now belonged to the same story. Before they left, they stood at the lantern and watched the pieces one more time. The pale aqua bubble glowed like a secret ready to be told when someone asked the right question. The clear square made a soft window on the far wall where the shadow of a leaf sat like a quiet guest. The white piece near the bottom gave back a breath of light each time the wick shifted, a steady exhale that made the room seem to nod. The green at the side deepened and softened and deepened again, a slow tide of color. They extinguished the flame and opened the door. Night had gathered along the hill, not heavy, only full. They stepped out and stood for a moment at the top of the slope to look down on the square where a handful of lamps made little circles on the pavement and where music drifted lightly from a window. They walked the path without rush. At the cafe, the owner greeted them with bowls and thanks and a story about the boy with red mittens who had insisted on checking whether the station cat's whiskers had collected any raindrops. They added their note to the board and pressed it with a small pin that had held many messages before theirs. Then they sat by the fern as they had on so many other evenings and let bread and warm soup and quiet laughter mend the last small tears the storm had made inside them. When they finally stepped back into the street and parted at their corner with the familiar tilt of head that felt like an embrace saved for morning, both carried a sense of something woven, not in thread but in patience. The greenhouse would stand. The hill would dry. The sea would remember its even breath. And when storms returned in some later season, as they always do in places where water meets sky, the room on the hill would be ready to listen again. And two people would be ready to listen with it, hands steady, eyes soft, hearts set to the pace they had learned together. A pace that had already proven strong enough to hold against wind and rain and the small trials that follow any